I think that it is important, when we're ever discussing a scientific subject, to define exactly what the subject matter is. What are the limits of our deliberations? What is to be included and what is to be excluded from our inquiries? Well, I can tell you straight away what is normally excluded from any discussions of biological or Darwinian evolution. We do not usually consider the origins of the universe. This is outside the scope of our investigations. We do not ask the question why this universe is so perfectly attuned to facilitate the existence of biological life. Why did the undifferentiated energy of the primordial universe coalesce into a system of subatomic particles and fundamental forces which billions of years later would be capable of creating life on Earth? 1,001 things have to be perfectly in place for life to evolve. What a miracle that all these things are in place to allow intelligent life to exist. Physicists, philosophers, and theologians have some ideas as to why this should be, but when studying biological evolution, we take this fortuitous situation as a given, and we do not try to explain the reasons for the existence of our universe. Secondly, studies of biological evolution do not even attempt to explain the origin of life on Earth. Again, Darwinian evolution does not consider this problem. We currently do not know how life on Earth got started. We can't, of course, exclude the possibility that life started somewhere else in the universe, but even then, we are currently at a loss to explain how it got started. There are some good theories about the origins of life, and research into this problem is making slow progress. I read somewhere that we might be within 50 years of solving this mystery. As we travel further down the path from the early universe to things like humans and butterflies, the other thing that we also don't consider is the momentous journey from the initial crude self-replicating molecule to the starting point of Darwinian evolution, which is the super-duper, all-singing, all-dancing DNA duplicating machine. This is not a trivial matter. Your body is composed of 10 or even 100 trillion cells, each with a full complement of genes. If you took just one of these cells and magnified it to the size of central Chicago, it would look a little bit like central Chicago. You would see a manufacturing process of sophistication almost beyond belief. Raw materials composed of little more than individual atoms and molecules would tear round this cell at breakneck speeds, creating new structures with remarkable accuracy, with all necessary component parts of this miraculous process being in the right place at the right time. We would wonder at this scene composed of millions of robots controlled by digital programs way beyond our ability to create or even understand. But again, Darwinian evolution takes the existence of this incredible duplicating machine as a given. An evolutionary theory only concerns itself with what happens after that point. We will return to the evolution of the DNA duplicating machine later. But before that, we have to ask ourselves further questions in order to establish whether this is in fact a subject worthy of scientific study. And the first question to ask is, did evolution actually happen? After all, the idea of evolution has as many detractors today as there were in Darwin's day. The simple and absolute answer to that question is yes, evolution did happen. Evolution must be the most proven theory in the history of scientific ideas. Because of the existence of innumerable creation myths, the idea of evolution has been faced with the opposition of stories created hundreds or thousands of years ago, claiming to explain life on Earth. These stories are deeply embedded in people's psyches. We didn't arrive at the theory of evolution by deduction, as with E equals mc squared, but by the methodology of induction. In my opinion, it was proven beyond any reasonable doubt in 1859 with the publication of On the Origin of Species. But an amazing vindication of the theory has surfaced gradually over the last 50 years. Darwin could imagine drawing a diagram linking all life on Earth by descent and tracing everything back to a common ancestor. Trees of life were constructed by the tedious discipline of studying bodily structures. Nowadays, if a new species were to be discovered, all you have to do is to spend a few $100 sequencing its genome and then entering the sequence into the computerized database of all known sequences of other organisms, and the computer will then, with no further human intervention, tell you where this new creature fits into the Darwinian tree of life. The computer can calculate how closely the new species is to other species, and it might even be able to say with some accuracy when the ancestors of the new species and the ancestors of Homo sapiens separated in the distant past. And guess what? The tree of life constructed by computers in this way looks almost exactly the same as the one constructed in Darwin's day. What a vindication! No, please believe me when I say there is not the slightest doubt that evolution has happened. The next question is, what exactly is the latest version of evolution? Well, this is a somewhat more difficult question to answer than you might think. The average 600-page textbook on evolution hardly mentions the latest version of the theory. You'd think that any reputable book on evolution would open with a statement of the theory. For some reason, they don't. The latest version of the theory of evolution is known as neo-Darwinism, and I have searched the literature to discover what exactly this theory states. Although it is difficult to find precisely who originally defined neo-Darwinism, my trawl through the literature can state the latest version of the theory of evolution as something like this. Evolution proceeds by the action of natural selection on the variety created by copying errors. Natural selection is a mechanism, and the variety created by copying errors is the raw material needed by that mechanism. What needs to be understood from this definition is that Darwin's natural selection does not by itself explain evolution. Darwin knew this. Natural selection is a mechanism that results from reproduction, competition, and variety. This mechanism relies on the ever-existing supply of variety. There would be nothing to select from if there was no variety. In a species where every organism is a little bit different, some will have a slight advantage in the struggle for survival. And this variety is always available. Where does it come from? Well, according to 20th century biology, it is provided by copying errors. This brings us naturally to the next question, which is this theory correct? The simple and most definite answer is a resounding no. The idea that a fortuitous series of errors could lead to the design of the most complex things in the universe is absurd. An error is an error is an error. Errors will do nothing but damage a genetic program. I'm not forgetting the sieve of natural selection here. I'm questioning the probability of even a single move in the right direction being caused by a random copying error. Never mind the trillions of useful copying errors needed to design Homo sapiens. No, the theory of copying errors has exactly the same likelihood of being correct as the Old Testament creation story. Both theories are equally improbable, and both are highly unscientific. So, we are now faced with an interesting problem. Firstly, yes, evolution has happened, and secondly, no, we haven't as yet got a satisfactory theory. Our minds can now be wonderfully concentrated on seeking the solution to this mystery. There is nothing more demotivating than trying to solve a problem that might not in fact have a solution. But we have established that evolution has in fact happened, and therefore it must be explainable. We know it's happened, but we don't yet know how. As many Darwin fans have discovered, Darwin nearly always turns out to be correct in his deliberations. What did he have to say about a comprehensive explanation of evolution? His book, after all, was mainly concerned with the mechanism part of the explanation for evolution, namely natural selection. But Darwin did mention the other side of the problem several times in his book. He knew that this missing link was one of the greatest weaknesses of the arguments in favour of evolution. But Darwin would never have believed in neo-Darwinism. He spelled out his opinion that there were unknown laws of variation which were in no way random. He writes, "I have hitherto sometimes spoken as if variations were due to chance. This, of course, is a wholly incorrect expression, but it serves to acknowledge plainly our ignorance of the cause of variation." At many points in his book, he admits to this missing link in his attempt to explain life on Earth. In chapter 5, for example, he refers to a tendency to vary due to causes of which we are quite ignorant. He coins the term generative variability to emphasize his belief in the existence of the laws of variety generation. He talks of an innate tendency to new variations. But he admits that our ignorance of the laws of variation is profound. He is convinced that there must be some efficient cause for each slight individual difference. When discussing the evolution of instincts, he speaks of variations produced by the same unknown causes which produce slight deviations of bodily structure. A very careful reading, and indeed a rereading, of On the Origin of Species is required in order to fully understand Darwin's view on evolutionary theory. The one thing that he did not claim is that his theory of natural selection was the full story of evolution. In his own words, he states, "I am convinced that natural selection has been the main, but not the exclusive, means of modification." Darwin was a competitive scientist, and in his great book he treads a fine line between expounding his theory in order to convince the public of its efficacy and pointing out the fact that it was an incomplete explanation of evolution. He knew that natural selection was a systematic mechanism, but in order for it to create new species, this mechanism required a constant supply of variation or new design. If the greatest ever thinker on evolution was convinced that there would eventually be discovered the laws of variation, why did 20th century biology completely ignore Darwin on this score? Neo-Darwinism refutes Darwin's ideas and claims that the incredible outpouring of new variety, which acts as the source of the raw material required by natural selection, is due to copying errors. A rather lame, non-scientific claim. The majority of modern thinkers on evolutionary theory seem to ignore the fact that evolution requires both a mechanism and the raw material required by this mechanism. This modern view was summarized by one of the greatest ever advocates for neo-Darwinism. Richard Dawkins, in an article in New Scientist, wrote, "Natural selection is quintessentially non-random, yet it is lamentably often miscalled random. This one mistake underlines much of the skeptical backlash against evolution. Chance cannot explain life. Design is as bad an explanation as chance, because it raises bigger questions than it answers. Evolution by natural selection is the only workable theory ever proposed that is capable of explaining life, and it does so brilliantly." No, Mr. Dawkins, natural selection by itself does not explain life brilliantly, and no one is saying that natural selection is a random process. With the benefit of Darwin's insight, we can now see that natural selection is an obvious and simple consequence of reproduction and overcrowding. It eliminates the less fit, but it does not design or create new organisms. It works on what is already there and leaves behind organisms and their genes that are better survivors. It can only work when it has a variety of organisms to choose from. It does not create those survivors. It merely changes the average characteristics of future generations by eliminating some and letting others continue into the future. It is a pure, mechanistic, non-random process, but it does not design new organisms. There is, in fact, only one scientific alternative to the theory of the copying error, or the random mutation. And the truth is that if the generation of variety isn't random, then it must be non-random. In other words, what we observe in life is an evolved mechanism for generating variety. Nothing random about it at all. Copying errors simply do not come into it. And what we describe as a process of evolution is in fact an evolved system in its own right. What proof is there for this? Well, the main proof is the fact that evolution has happened and is still happening. Imagine a 5-hour stop-frame film of all life on Earth. A film that takes just one frame every 10,000 years. Anyone watching such a film would see the morphing of one species into another, and other species splitting into two, each of whom would then morph in their own directions. You would see billions of species all morphing, some dying out and new ones arising from the old ones. You would naturally assume that there was obviously a very efficient system at work here, a system that was present in every species and every organism. Whenever change was needed, it was always available. No one in the right mind would associate such a fantastical system of change as due to trillions and trillions of fortuitous copying errors. This system is of the utmost creativity. How could such a system evolve? One thing that the rules of evolution state quite unequivocally is that evolution cannot predict the future. So how does life always morph in the right direction when a change of direction is needed? How do these fortuitous changes happen with such reliability? To understand this problem, we have to go back to that part of the story of life on Earth which is not covered by biologists. That part between the very first crude, almost inanimate, self-replicator and the appearance of the all-singing, all-dancing DNA duplicating machine, of sophistication almost beyond our imagination. Let's get back to basics. You are here because your genes have been good at getting into the future. This is the fundamental phenomenon that defines evolution. Only well-suited survivors make it into the future, and in a living world that has coalesced into species, then a measure of success of your type or your species compared to all other species in which you are in competition is the number of copies of your type that make it into the next generation. Think of some very fundamental characteristic that would help your type succeed in this brutal knockout competition. First and foremost, making a good copy of your type is vital. Your type wouldn't make it into the future unless it can accurately make a copy of itself. Any characteristic which you have that gives you an advantage will be lost if you can't make an accurate copy of that advantageous characteristic. So, one of the first characteristics to be selected for is copying fidelity. This characteristic is so important that any species without it will soon be eliminated. Competition between species to improve copying fidelity will continue until a system of accurate reproduction becomes almost perfect and can't easily be improved upon. All aspects of the DNA duplicating machine, which we think existed 3.5 billion years ago, were created by the competition to get into the future. In other words, by natural selection. Even the DNA code itself was selected for. There was competition for the best code, and once it was discovered by natural selection, then it spreads by natural selection to all species, and again, the best code becomes universal, as nothing better crops up. All aspects of the living cell were improved upon, as better cells had a survival advantage. These characteristics, which were forged by competition, cease to evolve as they reach a limit of perfection. The eukaryotic cell becomes another widespread success story, as does sexual reproduction. These characteristics did not appear by magic. They were honed by competition. The evolution of these characteristics, which I refer to as the universal systems, eventually ceases. There is no evolutionary change without variety. Natural selection needs variety to select from. With these super-duper universal systems in place, what is left for natural selection? These universal systems are not specific to any one species. They are useful to the whole of life on Earth. These characteristics represent pinnacles of evolutionary achievement. They can't easily be improved upon. Are there any other universal characteristics that we haven't as yet considered, which would be useful to life as a whole? Once we have the DNA duplicating machine honed to perfection, selective competition now only remains between characteristics that remain variable and are not universal. Here there is no pinnacle of perfection. There can be no superior organism that can wipe out all others. If we start with an imaginary world of clones, then because of reproduction and selfishness of genes, there will still be overcrowding and competition for survival. The slightest difference which might occur during reproduction will eventually throw up an organism with some type of advantage. Variety and competition will soon be re-established, and natural selection will favour the more fit. Remember, species are adapting. Different geological and climatic niches will abound throughout the world, and it is inconceivable that every organism will be an identical clone. There will always be variety, and therefore there will always be competition for your species. Your rivals, in other words, will be variable. We understand from Darwin that species are a naturally occurring phenomenon. We've established that the measure of success of your species or your type is the quantity of your particular type that gets into the future at the expense of other rival types in the niche that you are all trying to occupy. We've established that each organism is capable of making a good copy of itself. What possible characteristic will now give you and your species a selective advantage? Let's not ask at this stage what is possible, but let us simply ask what would be a good idea, and come back later to the question of whether this good idea could possibly evolve. Your enemy is around every corner. Not only is he variable, but he's also a moving target, and he could easily evolve into a different organism, a new enemy. The competition is not a constant. You are in a competition with varying and variable rivals. The essence of Darwin's theory is that your environment is composed of all other organisms. Remember, Darwin's theory is about competition. You are not in competition with geographical features such as climate and altitude. Your competitive environment consists of other life forms, and it would be a very poor defense if you could only adapt to a fixed, constant environment. Your environment is varying and variable, and it would be a much better form of defense if you could somehow be prepared for such a variable and varying environment. If your species wants to get into the future in greater numbers, then wouldn't it be a good idea if your species could survive an attack from numerous different types instead of just one type? In other words, to improve your survival chances, your population would benefit if it contained a range of slightly varying organisms who could cope with an attack from a wide range of enemies. A species composed of clones would be a disastrous strategy. A single enemy with any advantage over you would soon wipe you out. But if your species always contained at least a few individuals who could survive the attack, then these species could pass on their useful genes to the next generation, and the species would survive. The question is, how on earth can such useful variety be maintained? And what about the ever-evolving competition? Evolution has no way of predicting the future. We need to look no further than our own immune system to observe a model of surviving in a variable and varying environment. The attacks on our immune system might be varying and variable, but this variation is limited in its range and scope, and our immune system has learned how to cope with this limited range of enemies. Viruses have similar structures to each other, as have bacteria. They can only vary in a limited number of ways, and therefore the immune system has to produce a limited number of defense shields in order to protect your body from attack. The enemy is not unlimited. Our immune system has evolved the ability to counter attacks from a range of organisms. The immune system has adapted to this range of enemies because it has encountered this range of enemies early in its evolutionary history and has come up with a system for surviving an attack by this limited range of enemies. The long-term evolutionary survival of a species has come up with a similar technique. The ability to maintain a limited range of variability in the population of a species would have evolved when we were single-celled bacteria. It was in the period when all the other universal systems were evolving that the system of maintaining variety within a species population was similarly evolved. The opposition was not unlimited. Bacteria all use the same code. They all manufacture similar chemicals, and therefore the range of enemies and the range of defences required is not unlimited. And a system for adapting to a variable environment, and remember by environment I'm talking about all other species out there, would have been one of those early universal systems evolved along with the others which I have already mentioned. We still haven't discussed whether it is logically possible for such a system to evolve, but at least we've established that it's certainly a good idea. The evolution of this variety-maintaining system happened when we were all single-celled. Making an exact copy of yourself is a bad idea for the species. A species permanently consisting entirely of clones is doomed to extinction. Species containing a range of possibilities would have an advantage. But hang on, aren't we talking about competition between whole species here? This idea is anathema to the theory of the selfish gene. Genes get into the future by looking after themselves only. They are not going to do very well if they sacrifice themselves in order to reproduce a different gene in order to help the survival of the species as a whole. Immediate survival strategies are what is needed to get you into the future, and sacrificing yourself is a very bad idea. Selfish genes which don't make this sacrifice will have an immediate advantage. They will get into the next generation in greater numbers than genes who will make this sacrifice. Selfishness will always win out. But how does the new theory of variety maintenance overcome the important principle of the selfish gene? We now come to the crux of the new theory. Because the biological study of evolution always starts with the super-duper DNA duplicating machine, we tend to overlook the fact that universal or partially universal characteristics such as asexual and sexual reproduction, multicellularity, the eukaryotic cell, and the DNA code itself all need genes, or more accurately, stretches of DNA code, to exist. But these systems have ceased to evolve. There is little competition for these systems, and yet they still require genes. These genes work in the background, and because of their universality, they always get into the future no matter who wins the battle of survival between competing organisms. Universal genes, which are responsible for the operating systems of life, are still selfish, and one of their strategies for success is that they exist in the genomes of every organism, not just some. They get into the future every time. Genes for maintaining variety are in the same category. The existence of these genes explains things like the disadvantage, from the selfish gene theory point of view, of sexual reproduction. These universal genes explain the existence of altruism and group selection. Altruism is anathema to strict disciples of the selfish gene theory. According to the selfish gene theory, genes that aren't altruistic will always eliminate genes that make a sacrifice for others. But a gene that works behind the scenes and controls the outcome of reproduction to always create, for example, 50% altruist and 50% selfish genes, will always survive. And even though altruists will be at a selective disadvantage in the population, new ones will always come on stream because the genes for maintaining this variety exist in both selfish and altruistic organisms. The genes responsible for maintaining variety exist in the genomes of both winners and losers in the battle to get into the future. The continued existence of altruistic genes is due to the existence of variety-maintaining genes, or mutator genes, as I will now call them. With these mutator genes, the contribution of altruists at the species or group level will increase the number of survivors in the group at a faster rate than the reduction in the numbers caused by the selfish genes eliminating altruistic genes at the lower level of selection. A simple experiment using computerized genetic algorithms can easily demonstrate that the advantage for the group is maintained when we include in the computer program the existence of universal mutator genes that work behind the scenes and are now invisible to natural selection. Species with mutator genes will do better than species without them. Mutator genes will therefore be selected for. So, there we have it. Mutator or variety-maintaining genes which maintain a limited range of variety at the level of the single cell. This variety is limited, as with the immune system, to the creation of organisms which can survive an attack by enemies that they have already seen in their evolutionary history. The limited range of the opposition is the reason why the mutated genes can learn, in an algorithmic sense, something about all likely enemies. I use the term mutated genes in a conceptual way. We're probably not really talking about a single gene that maintains variety. The genome probably contains a whole system for creating and maintaining variety. Andreas Wagner, in his book Arrival of the Fittest, describes one way in which the genes have evolved to enable an organism or its species to swiftly navigate through a mind-boggling number of possibilities. This navigation is facilitated by the redundancy built into the genetic code. A single amino acid can be built by a different combination of codons. A single protein can be made by different combinations of amino acids, and a single metabolic process can be made by different combinations of proteins. So, this is fine so far, but how does the system evolved in the primordial days of single-celled organisms explain the evolution of complex organisms that currently exist? In other words, how does complexity emerge from a system of limited variation at the level of a single cell? The answer lies with another wonderful characteristic of life, the ability of different cells to cooperate to build complex organisms. Working in teams has been a characteristic of genes from day one. Organisms are built from a network of cooperating genes, but with individual genes and the cells they create now varying around a limited mean, the organism constructed could be made of a unique combination of genes and cells never seen before. If this unique combination can build an organism that finds a new niche, then this new unique organism will survive and proliferate. Take the usual evolutionary example of the giraffe. With mutated genes operating in every part of the animal's physical structures, each generation could throw up minor variations in neck length, leg length, and heart strength. On the laws of probability alone, one of these combinations will occasionally be for a longer neck, longer legs, and a stronger heart, which is needed to pump blood to higher levels. It is this unique combination of genes and characteristics that is selected to enable the animal to move into a new niche of feeding on leaves of tall trees. So, there we have it. What has really evolved is a system that we normally describe as evolution. Organisms have a built-in mechanism to enable them to morph from one shape to another over evolutionary time, or to exchange one behavioural characteristic for another. Copying errors just wouldn't get us anywhere. The imagined fast-forward stop-frame film of 4 billion years of life on Earth would surely demonstrate the existence of such a system. Darwin knew that there were laws of variation. He made a brave but ultimately failed attempt to explain some of this variation with his theory of use and disuse. This was the idea that doing press-ups in your own lifetime would lead your descendants to having bigger muscles. The outcome to such a theory is very similar to the outcome produced by mutated genes. Darwin didn't know about genes, and he didn't know that the germline is largely insulated from the soma, or the body. The new theory needs no such transmission of information from the soma to the germline. Pre-adaptation and the search for empty niches gains more importance with the new theory. Organisms will always search out empty niches with less competition, just like humanity has emigrated to every nook and cranny of the Earth's surface to escape from the murderous competition that exists in more crowded environments. Evolution is fueled by the availability of empty niches. There aren't as many as there were in the pre-Cambrian era or after a mass extinction, but the niche requiring sophistication and complexity beyond anything previously achieved will always be available and will always be searched out by this algorithmic process. Evolution can then be seen as a systematic search through the expanse of design possibility or design space.